Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to look at creating pivot tables in a little more detail than we did in the preceding section. And I'm going to create another pivot table from the same starting point, but I'm going to take it step by step and take a look at the other options that are available. Now, the first thing I've done is convert the table with the source data in it back to being a range again. So it's no longer a source table. I already mentioned that it's a good idea to use a table as the basis of a pivot table. So I am going to turn it back into a table again, but I'm only going to use part of it. I have over 30,000 rows of data, and I'm going to use roughly 15,000 of them to create my pivot table from. So let's go up to the Insert ribbon and go down to Table. And now the Create Table dialog identifies the range. And what I'm going to do is just use the first 15,000 rows. So I'm going to edit this and remove those rows and say I just want the first 15,000. My table does have headers, so I'm going to click OK. So now I only have a little over half of that data in the table, and I'm going to change its name to sales underscore table. And now I'm going to insert my pivot table. So back to the Insert ribbon and Pivot Table. And that gives me the Create Pivot Table dialog. Let's start at the top. Excel is giving me the table I have selected. So in this case, sales underscore table, which is fine. Note the alternative is use external data source. Now, I might choose one of my connections and get data from one of my connections. You can in fact turn any appropriate transactional data into a pivot table and use that as the source of your pivot table. You can also choose to use this workbook's data model. I mentioned the data model in a much earlier section, and if you are, for instance, combining various data sources and building a data model, you may in fact use a data model as the source of the pivot table. That's outside of the scope of what we're doing here, but it is a very important option if you're combining data from a number of different sources. The second set of option buttons there let you choose whether to put the table onto a new worksheet, which is what I normally do, or you can add the pivot table to an existing worksheet. Also note the checkbox at the bottom, which will let you add the data to the data model. And again, we're not really dealing with the data model in this course, so I'm going to stick with the data from the table, and it's going to go onto a new worksheet. Now what you can see here is the bare bones of a pivot table. There isn't actually a pivot table there at the moment, just a space for one. But until I select at least one field, I won't have a pivot table. I'm going to rename this sheet. And one thing to point out here is that this panel on the right, if you click on the header, you can actually move it around, drag it and drop it to wherever you want. And of course you can expand it, collapse it, do whatever you like with it. I prefer to have it docked over on the right hand side, but just be aware that you can float that panel out as well. Now when you're dealing with the fields of data in a pivot table, they can vary greatly between different sets of data, but there are certain defaults that apply and well worth knowing about. The first field I'm going to add to this pivot table is a date field, and date fields by default are added as rows. So you'll see as I select the dates here, it goes into the rows section at the bottom. And note that it picks up a default categorization of month. So the dates there are divided into the months of the year. Note here that we only have 4 months covering the data. Note also that values by default occupy the values drop zone. So now we have the sum by month over those 4 months that cover all of the data from the first 15,000 rows. Now if we return to the dates for just a moment, if I click on the month of March and expand it, you see each individual day for the month of March, and with that day the sum of value of sales, and that is of course covering all of the branches. Note that if I hover over each cell, I can see the figure for that cell, so the sum of the value, and it says it's in row March, and I'm seeing data for the 5th of March. If I didn't want that month categorization, I could just turn it off in my pivot table fields. But then I finish up with all of the days in sequence. Now, that's not normally something I recommend as an option, but it is as easy to do as that. I could also switch off date, and then all I have are my month totals, but without the ability to break down into individual days. Now let me introduce branch. Branch is a text field, so by default it will be added to the rows. Watch where it goes in the rows. It goes below date. And now if I were to expand, say, January, under each day in January, I can see the figures for the 4 branches. Note the hierarchy now under rows, months, dates, branch. How do you think it would look if I dragged branch up to the top? Now, of course, we have the 4 branches, and under each branch we have the months figures that we can break down into daily figures. Now let's add department. It's another text field, so it will get added as a row, but what I'm going to do is drag department over to columns. Now you can see that the table gives us a much more detailed breakdown by department, by branch, and by date as well. And of course, we can pivot these in any way that we want. So if I wanted to put branches in the columns and departments in the rows, that's fine as well. So let's do that. I'm going to put branches in the column, department in the rows, and I get a different display. Note that for the period of the data covered by the reduced version of the table, we only have some of the departments. Let's go back to the store data and just change that table at this point. So the Table Tools Design tab has a Resize Table option. Notice it's got our 15,000 rows, so let's set it to the maximum figure of 34,109. And OK. Let's go back and take a look at our pivot table. Now on the Analyze tab in the Pivot Table Tools contextual ribbon, there is a Refresh button. Click on Refresh. And now, of course, we can see for all departments and the figures for the whole period of time covered by our data, because we now have all of that data in our table. Now I want to look briefly at 1 or 2 examples of ways that you can control the data in a pivot table, and also how you can control the formatting of the pivot table. Let's start by looking at date. When I added the date into the pivot table, we had days and months, and there is a reason for that. Notice I have the month there selected, January, and on the Analyze tab, which is available under the Pivot Table Tools contextual ribbon, there is a group, and in there I have different options: group field, ungroup, and group selection. So I'm going to click group field. And for a date field or a date and time field, there are a number of standard ways of grouping those, and this is set up to provide days and months, which is what you've seen so far. If instead of providing days and months, I only wanted to be able to work in months, I could uncheck days, and then only months would be available. Note also that Excel has detected the start of the period, covering the data that is included in this pivot table. So now I only have the dates in months. I can't break them down by day anymore. I haven't lost the data. I could just go back into that group field option and switch the days back on again. But sometimes you either want to change the high level grouping, or sometimes, as here, you may well say, well, I never want to look at the individual days as I'm looking at the overall figures. So grouping is another very important aspect of how to present the data. 1 or 2 other features on here, such as slicers, we're going to look at in the next section. Now, let's look at a couple of aspects of formatting. You know that these are amounts of money, but you may actually want to indicate that they are amounts of money. What you don't want to do is select all of these fields in the body of the pivot table and format them as currency, because as soon as the data changes, they would all be thrown out. There is in effect a styling approach to this, so all you need to do is select one of the values, and on the Analyze tab, one of the options is Field Settings. What you've got in here is the sum of value. That is, you have the sum of the value. So in this case, the breads that were sold in Phoenix in January. Note that whilst what we have here is the sum of all the transactions, I could replace it by the count or the average or the max or the min. Now I'm going to stick with sum, but you could actually change how you summarize that data from here. What I'm interested in doing is going into number format. And for these, I want to show as currency with no decimal place. And click OK. And OK again. And now those amounts are shown in whole dollars. And I'm sure by now you've seen the power of pivot tables, but of course there's still a lot more to find out about them. But one other thing, you may have been looking at this pivot table and looking at the totals, and not everybody likes to have their totals at the top of each section. So if you look here for breads, I have my totals for Atlanta, in B5, Detroit, Houston, Phoenix, so on and so forth. So those are the totals, but they're showing across the top. Personally, I like to have them under my data. So you can again change that in pivot tables. Looking at things that way doesn't always suit everybody. So on the Design tab in our Pivot Table Tools ribbon, we can change the layout or the design of the overall report. What we have now is what we call the compact form. I could say show this in tabular form, and in tabular form you have the more conventional layout whereby the totals are at the bottom of each column. So that's it for working with pivot tables. In the next section we're going to look at filters and slicers, so please join me for that.